January 22, 1991. Western Iraq, 300 kilometers north of the Saudi Arabian border. A column of vehicles moves through the darkness across open desert, heading deeper into Iraqi territory. The vehicles are Land Rovers, not armored Land Rovers, not modified military variants with any kind of ballistic protection. Standard 110-inch wheelbase civilian Land Rovers, the same model sold to farmers and safari operators across the world, stripped of their doors, their windscreens folded flat, their roofs removed entirely. They carry no armor plating. A rifle round fired at any part of the vehicle body will pass straight through. What they do carry is everything else. Twin-mounted general-purpose machine guns on swivel rings, AT-5P caliber M2 Browning capable of destroying light vehicles beyond a kilometer. Milan anti-tank missile launchers, 84mm Carl Gustav recoilless rifles, smoke grenades, enough ammunition to sustain a private war for days, and fuel for a range of several hundred kilometers. The men inside are from 22 SAS. They are 300 kilometers inside a country they are at war with. The nearest friendly unit is half a country away. The vehicles are painted pink. Not camouflage green, not desert tan, not any color that any military procurement manual has ever specified for a combat vehicle. Pink. The SAS call them pinkies. By the time the Gulf War ground campaign ended 3 weeks later, 12 such columns had destroyed multiple Scud ballistic missile launchers, dozens of communications installations, radar stations, fuel and ammunition dumps, and a significant portion of Iraq's early warning network. They had done it in vehicles that any civilian could have bought from a Land Rover dealership. And they had been doing exactly this in one desert or another for 20 years before the cameras of the Gulf War ever found them. To understand why the SAS drove pink Land Rovers into armies, you need to understand the operational philosophy that created them. In July 1941, a young lieutenant named David Sterling submitted a paper to the British Middle East Command proposing a new kind of unit. The paper argued that small teams of exceptional men, operating with surprise and exact intelligence at long range, could inflict damage on the enemy's rear areas out of all proportion to their numbers. 5 men could destroy on the ground what squadrons of aircraft could not reliably destroy in the air. 10 men could operate for weeks behind enemy lines if they had the right vehicle and the right training. The right vehicle in 1941 was the Willys Jeep, modified with twin Vickers K machine guns and extended fuel capacity. The right vehicle, by 1970, was the Land Rover. Everything else was the same. The SAS had spent the intervening 3 decades refining the concept across Malaya, Borneo, Aden, and a dozen operations that official records still decline to describe in detail. By 1970, the pink Land Rover was the physical expression of a doctrine that had outfought conventional military forces on 4 continents. It looked wrong because the doctrine looked wrong to anyone who had not seen it work, and it had worked every single time. In July 1970, Sultan Qaboos bin Said deposed his father in a palace coup in Oman and immediately inherited a war he was losing. The Dhofar region in the south of the country was controlled by the People's Front for the Liberation of Oman and the Arabian Gulf, known as PFLOAG. The organization was Marxist in ideology, backed by South Yemen, and supplied through a weapons pipeline that brought Soviet AK-4 7S RPG-7 anti-tank rockets, Katyusha multiple rocket launchers, and Chinese 75mm recoilless rifles across the border from what is now Yemen. By the time Qaboos took power, PFLOAG controlled the Jebel Dhofar, the vast mountainous plateau above the coastal city of Salalah, and was advancing. The Sultanate of Oman's armed forces were equipped, partially trained, and significantly outnumbered on the Jebel. Without a change in the operational situation, Oman would follow South Yemen into the Soviet-backed Marxist bloc. The Persian Gulf oil routes would be threatened. Britain's strategic position in the region would collapse. The British government's formal commitment was limited. The SAS commitment, channeled through loan service officers and contract personnel whose presence required careful management of public records, was not limited at all. The first SAS squadron arrived in country in 1970. Their Pink Panthers arrived with them. The Land Rover that the SAS deployed to Dhofar had begun its life as a standard Series IIA or Series 3 309-inch or 110-inch wheelbase civilian vehicle built at the Solihull factory in the West Midlands. What it became under SAS modification was a different machine. The standard engine was retained, a 2.25-liter petrol or diesel unit producing between 67 and 86 horsepower, but everything that could be removed had been stripped away. Doors gone. Windscreen folded flat or removed entirely. Roof gone. Internal paneling stripped. The weight saved was immediately reinvested in weapons and ammunition. A GPMG L7A2 general-purpose machine gun went onto a forward pintle mount above and ahead of the passenger seat, giving the front gunner a wide arc of fire across the vehicle's approach axis. A second mount went at the rear for another GPMG or A-50 caliber M2 Browning. On some configurations, a third weapon was mounted amidships. The ammunition load for 3 machine guns across an extended patrol could run to tens of thousands of rounds. Anti-armor capability came from a Milan launcher on a rear mount capable of defeating any armored vehicle in the Soviet or Arab inventory, or from the 84mm Carl Gustav that the front passenger carried. Personal weapons for every crew member were additional. Fuel jerry cans were strapped along both sides of the vehicle, extending operational range from the standard 450 kilometers to 600 or 700 kilometers without refueling. Water containers went wherever the fuel cans were not. Navigation equipment, medical supplies, demolition charges, and the personal equipment of 3 to 4 men completed the load. Combat loaded, the vehicle was carrying between 1 and 2 tons above its designed payload. Land Rover's engineers would have found the loading figures alarming. The vehicle went anyway. The pink. The specific shade that the SAS applied to their Land Rovers in desert operations has no official designation in any procurement document. The origin of the color is disputed across multiple accounts written by men who were there and remember the story differently. One account traces it to aerial photography of the Western Desert in the Second World War, where processed film of standard military vehicles at certain light angles showed them as pink against the desert background, prompting investigation of whether the camera was recording something real about desert camouflage. Another account places the discovery in Oman, where a paint mixing error at a forward operating base produced an unintended shade that subsequent field testing showed performed better than sand or khaki at dawn and dusk in desert terrain. The operational logic, once understood, is straightforward. Desert sand at low sun angles, the first and last light of each day, reflects light in the pink-red spectrum. A vehicle painted to match that reflected light is visually absorbed into the landscape at precisely the hours when military vehicles are most likely to be moving and most likely to be observed. At midday under high sun, the camouflage is less effective. But SAS mobile columns moved at night and lagered under camouflage nets by day, and the critical vulnerability windows were the transitional hours of dawn and dusk when thermal imaging was least reliable and visual detection at distance was governed by light angle and color reflection rather than shape. The pink worked. British Army testing subsequently confirmed that the specific shade chosen by the SAS outperformed standard sand camouflage at low sun angles in desert terrain. The color was never officially changed. It remains in use. In October 1971, the SAS mounted Operation Jaguar, the first major offensive to retake the eastern Jebel Dhofar from PFLOAG. The assault force consisted of 9 SAS soldiers and approximately 200 Furkat fighters, former PFLOAG, men who had changed sides through the SAS's civil affairs and reconciliation program. They moved by night onto the plateau and established a position at Jibjat. PFLOAG counterattacked. The position held. From Jibjat, the SAS and Furkat began expanding the perimeter of Sultan's control through the same method that had worked in Malaya 2 decades earlier. Presence, medical care, veterinary support for the livestock the Jabali economy depended on, and wells. You defeat an insurgency not primarily by killing its fighters, but by removing the reason the population supports them. PFLOAG had won support by providing services the Sultan's government had not provided. The SAS provided them instead. The Pink Panthers provided the mobility to deliver those services, to move Furkat units rapidly across the Jebel to reinforce threatened positions, and to conduct the long-range patrols that kept PFLOAG off balance across a front too wide for conventional infantry to cover. By 1975, PFLOAG had been pushed back to the border. By 1976, the war was over. The Sultan's authority covered all of Dhofar. The assessment of the campaign by the British Army's own after-action process identified the SAS role as decisive. On the morning of July 19, 1972, 250 PFLOAG fighters attacked the coastal town of Mirbat. They had 75mm artillery, 84mm recoilless rifles, mortars, and automatic weapons. The town was held by 9 SAS soldiers, a small Omani garrison, and a group of Dhofar gendarmerie. The SAS team commander was Captain Mike Keeley. What followed was 4 hours of fighting that the regiment still considers among the most significant actions in its history. The PFLOAG force outnumbered the defenders by more than 20 to 1. They had heavier weapons. They had prepared the attack for weeks. One SAS trooper, Corporal Labalaba, was killed serving a 25-pounder artillery piece designed for a crew of 6. Operating it alone until he was fatally wounded, continuing to serve the gun until he could no longer stand. The attack failed. PFLOAG lost approximately 80 dead against 2 SAS men killed. It was the turning point of the Dhofar campaign. PFLOAG never again attempted a massed assault on a defended position. The Battle of Mirbat ended the possibility of a PFLOAG military victory. A Pink Panther moved ammunition and personnel between positions during the battle. It was not the decisive weapon at Mirbat. The decisive weapons were 9 SAS soldiers who refused to accept the arithmetic that said they should lose. But the vehicle that connected them under fire in the specific terrain of Dhofar's coast was a Land Rover. The Pink Panthers that went to the Gulf War in 1991 were the same vehicles, in the same operational concept, that had operated in Dhofar 15 years earlier. The crews were different. The desert was different. The enemy was a conventional army of 400,000 men rather than a Marxist insurgency on a mountain plateau. The concept was identical. Small teams, long range, complete surprise, disproportionate destruction. The vehicle that made it possible was still a pink Land Rover with no armor and more weapons than any vehicle its size had a right to carry. In August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. The coalition that formed to expel them faced a strategic problem that air power could not solve. Iraq had modified its Soviet-supplied Scud B ballistic missiles into extended-range Al-Hussein variants with smaller warheads but the ability to reach Israel from western Iraq. Each Scud that hit Israel risked drawing Israel into the war, which risked fracturing the Arab coalition partners whose political participation was essential to the campaign's legitimacy. Coalition aircraft flew thousands of sorties looking for Scud mobile launchers in western Iraq. The launchers were truck-mounted, moved immediately after firing, and were effectively invisible to aerial reconnaissance in flat terrain. The SAS could find them. In January 1991, 3 mobile fighting columns from A&D squadrons crossed the Saudi border into Iraq. Each column carried between 12 and 15 Pink Panthers and variants, loaded to combat configuration. The columns drove north into the Al-Anbar Desert, 200 to 400 kilometers behind the front line. They lay up under vehicle camouflage nets during daylight hours and moved and operated at night. They attacked Scud launcher sites when they found them, destroyed the communications relay infrastructure that supported the launch network, attacked the fiber optic cable junctions that carried Scud targeting data, and engaged Iraqi military patrols that came within range. They called in airstrikes on targets too large or too hardened for their vehicle weapons. They sustained this operational tempo for 3 weeks, refueling from cached supplies, and at times from vehicles flown in by helicopter, until the ground campaign ended the war. The strategic Scud threat to Israel was substantially degraded during this period. The role of SAS mobile column operations in that degradation is assessed by British military analysts as significant. The men who achieved it were in vehicles with no armor, no protection against any weapon larger than a pistol, and a color scheme their manufacturer had never contemplated. The Pink Panther Land Rover was succeeded formally by the Land Rover WMIK, the weapons mount installation kit variant, which took the improvised mounting arrangements that SAS mechanics had been developing since the 1960s and standardized them into a production configuration. The WMIK saw service in Bosnia, Kosovo, Sierra Leone, Iraq, and Afghanistan. It was replaced by the Jackal, a purpose-designed high-mobility weapons carrier built by Coyote Tactical Systems that abandoned the Land Rover platform entirely but preserved every element of the operational concept. Unarmored, fast, long-range, heavily armed, capable of operating far beyond the range of conventional support. British Special Forces in Helmand Province operated the Jackal in exactly the mode that Pink Panthers had operated in Dhofar. Small teams, extreme range, overwhelming firepower relative to crew size, moving faster than the enemy could predict or respond. The Jackal's descendant, the Coyote, currently serves with British forces. The operational concept that the Pink Panther Land Rover embodied has never been replaced. It has only been refined. January 22nd, 1991. The column of pink Land Rovers moves through the Iraqi desert, 300 kilometers from anyone who can help. The vehicles have no armor. The color scheme defies every convention of military camouflage that was written before someone tested the alternatives. The men inside have been conducting operations like this, in deserts like this, against armies like this, since 1970. They do not look like an army. They look wrong. They look like a convoy of stripped-down farm vehicles that has lost its way in the dark. They carry between them a combined weight of weapons and ammunition that exceeds anything a comparable number of conventional soldiers could carry or deploy. They operate at a range from friendly forces that conventional military doctrine says require supply lines, air cover, and communications infrastructure that they do not have. In 3 weeks, they and the other 11 columns operating simultaneously across western Iraq will have degraded a country's strategic capability more effectively than the air campaign achieved against the same targets. They will do it with weapons mounted on vehicles that cost less per unit than a single air-to-ground missile. They will do it because David Sterling was right in 1941. 5 men with the right vehicle, the right training, and complete surprise can do what squadrons cannot. The right vehicle from 1970 to the end of the Gulf War and beyond was a pink Land Rover. It looked ridiculous. It was the most effective weapon system Britain fielded in 3 decades of irregular warfare. And it was painted pink because pink is invisible at dawn in the desert, and the men who chose the color were not interested in what the choice looked like. They were